So before we start doing this, again, it's kind of like what I just showed you the end of the hour yesterday. Square roots involve this sign. Most people call this a square root sign, but that's not its actual name. Anyone know what that, like this is called a plus sign, this is a minus sign, this is a divide sign. It's not a square root sign.
Radican.
It's a radical.
You're radical, kind of.
The number underneath is called the radicand. So the reason why we call it a square root is this. You can have square roots, you can have cube roots, you can have fourth roots, fifth roots, and so on. A square root, since it's the first of all these radicals, they just don't put the 2 there. So if you see this, it's just assume that there's a 2 there. So like the square root of 4 is 2. We're doing quadratics, so we won't be doing cubes and fourth roots and fifth roots, because quadratics are just squared. But a square root means what number times itself equals the radicand. Cube root, the cube root of 8 is 2. 2 times 2 times 2. The fourth root of 16 is 2. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. The fifth root of 32 is 2. 2 times 2 times 2. Okay, so that's how these roots work, which you don't do till algebra 2 in 11th grade. So, the perfect squares, obviously square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 0 is perfect also, it's 0. And then it's square root of 4, square root of 9, square root of 16, and so on. Oops. You are gonna, well, you got a calculator, so you don't have to memorize these, but when we start simplifying radicals, which we'll start on Monday, you need to find the perfect square that goes into the number. So if you know these, it just makes it a lot easier for you. The first 10 anyway, which if you just think about it, they're not too tough.
You just have to think about like 7 times 7.
Yep, 7 times 7, 8 times 8, 9 times 9, 10 times 10, okay? So, a radical, the square root of 36 is 6, right? The square root of negative 16 is what?
4, negative 4, 1/4.
Now remember, the rule is for a radical, square root is what number multiplied times itself will give you that number. 6 times 6 is 36, so this one actually has 2 solutions. Remember, what's the other answer? Negative 6, because negative 6 times negative 6 is 36.
So negative 4?
Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16.
So it says a plus and minus.
But it's got to be the number times itself. It's not that hard, but it's kind of a mind twister.
16.
No. Since you can't think of it, what's it got to be?
Nothing.
No solution.
Oh.
You cannot have a negative number under a square root. If you tried this on your calculator, you'd get an error. But don't get it confused with these. If the negative is outside, then it's fine. You just figure out what that is, it's 4, and then the negative just stays there. Okay? We're gonna put the iPads away. So, positive square root, negative square root is just like I did for 36. The square root of 4, you can have, it could equal 2, or it could equal negative 2. Positive 2 or negative 2. So remember, you can write them separate, save time. You could write it like this, plus or minus 2. Now, when we get to actual applications of square roots, we usually don't worry about putting the negative down. because a lot of these involves distance, and distance is never negative. But you just need to realize it couldn't be this. Now, someone asked yesterday, are they always opposites of each other? They are when they're easy ones like this, but when we start solving what's called the quadratic formula, then they won't be the same number. One will be positive, one negative, but sometimes they're different numbers. And you'll see why when we get to that. So the radicand, not a big deal if you don't know what it is, but it's the number underneath the square root. Perfect squares, like that. You can have a perfect square that's a decimal.
Like what?
If I had the square root of 17.64, if I square root that, it's 4.2. So if you square root something and it stops, that's a perfect square, even though it's a decimal. The non-perfect squares go on and on without repeating. So that gets us to, you learned this last year and they had it on the MCA test, irrational numbers. The perfect squares are all rational. Rational means you can write as a fraction. Because square root of 1 is 1, we could write that as 1 over 1. 2 over 1. We can write every one of these as a fraction. The irrational numbers, everyone put the iPads away. The irrational are all the ones in between. Square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 5, square root of 6, 7, 8, and then it skips 9, 10. The reason why is because these are decimals that go on and on without repeating. Okay? Or it's 1.41, I think. So the easiest thing to remember with rational numbers, or irrational, is the most common one is pi. And then all the square roots that are not perfect squares. Also cubed roots, but we don't deal with the cubed roots this year, so these are the only ones we got to worry about. A radical expression is just an expression with a square root sign in it.
Suck it.
A leading coefficient.
Oh my God, it's so good.
Anyone remember what a coefficient is?
No.
If you have 2x, which one's the variable?
2.
X, and which one's the coefficient?
2.
2. Coefficient is the number in front of a letter. So if you've got 3x squared plus 2x minus 4, if you had to guess which is the leading coefficient, 3. It's the number in front of the letter with the biggest exponent. So if they wrote this backwards, if you had 4x minus 2x squared plus 7, this is the biggest exponent, so this would be the leading coefficient. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. You really don't need to know, though, what the leading one is. You just need to know how to spot the coefficients. So, on these, square root of 49 is 7 or negative 7. Now this negative out in front, if it's 7, it would just be negative 7, right? If it's negative 7, you'd have negative negative 7, which would turn to positive. So it still is that.
But that's a negative in front of the.
The reason why is this negative would stay here. Square root of 49 is 7, so you could have negative 7.
Oh, yeah.
Or the negative would stay there, and then this could be negative 7, which would cancel. So, either way. This one, what's the two answers?
7 and negative
This one?
3 and negative 3.
No solution. Can't have a negative underneath the sign.
3 times 2. Wait, you can't have what?
Can't have a negative because, remember,
Oh, yeah.
you can't take anything times itself and get a negative.
Yeah.
Square root of zero?
Zero.
Zero.
Oh,
Now we're getting to, this is the kind of the beginning of the quadratic formula for you. Square root of b squared minus 4ac. The reason why they give you this expression is because it's part of the quadratic formula, which you need to do to use to solve quadratic equations. So, they tell us that a is negative 7, so that goes there. B is 8, so that goes there. C is negative 1, so that goes there. So it would be 8 squared minus 4 times A times C. Now, the biggest problem is people put this in the calculator wrong. On these calculators, remember, you can put the square root sign first.
But I don't need to put parentheses.
You really don't on this because the whole thing is underneath the parenthesis. And when you type in, it keeps extending this line until you put a parenthesis, which you wouldn't have to because there's nothing outside of it. All right? Now when we get to the actual quadratic formula though, it does end, you do have to put a parenthesis to stop it. So I'll remind you when we get to that. So this calculator, you put the square root sign first and then everything underneath. These, you do what's underneath, and then you gotta press equals to figure out what this is, and then you put the square root sign. Remember these, you do it backwards. Everyone knows that? If not, you do now. So for this, it is 8 squared, or square root, 8 squared. You guys know which button to hit for the squared key? This one you can use caret, but it has an x squared key right next to there. Minus 4 times negative 7. Remember, don't hit the minus sign, hit the negative sign. Times negative 1, and then you just got to press equals, and you get 6. Nope. I mean, you could put it in like this, but that's just times. So on this calculator, you'd have to type this in first. 8 squared minus 4 times 7, and then the negative key you put in after the number, right there, times 1 negative, and then you got to press equals to figure out what that is, and then you square root it. And you get the same answer. Okay? Now, it's kind of hard to screw this one up. The ones that do get screwed up is when b is a negative number. I'll show you why. See if we got one. Yeah, right here. So it would be the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. The reason why this calculator is going to mess it up for you if you put it in like that, if you hit square root and then press negative 3 squared, it's going to count that as negative 9. Because it doesn't take into effect that you're squaring the negative also. In this, when you square something, it's always going to be positive. Remember squaring, you take it times itself? So the easiest thing to remember on this is always going to be positive, no matter what. No matter if it's a negative or a positive. So just a hint to make sure it comes out correct. If b is a negative, don't even bother putting it inside there. Just leave the negative off. That way it doesn't matter how you put it in. The actual answer then would be you'd get 5. Okay, if you just typed it in like that, -3 squared minus 4 times 2 times -2, you would get 2.6457. The reason why is this negative right here. It's squaring that, making it 9, but then that makes it a negative. Added to 16. Okay? These calculators does it correctly. If you put in -3 squared, it does make it a 9. So it's just these you gotta watch out for.
Why is it different like that?
You know, the different brands of calculators do it differently. Okay. So that's all we're doing really today is the simple solving.
David.
We do have some with a calculator where you just have to find, when it says evaluate, square root of 24.01. So that's just, remember the negative can be outside but not inside. If it was inside, you just put no solution. So here all you do is you square root that, it's 4.9. And remember, this could be positive or negative. So it really doesn't matter if there's a negative in front of it because the negative and the positive would make it negative and the negative and negative would make it positive. That make sense to everyone? Now again, when we get to more applications, we don't worry about the negative part of it. It doesn't come into play, but you just need to know it can be both.